Well, Rick Warren is known to millions as the author of The Purpose-Driven Life. He's also pastor of the Saddleback Church family that now has stretched congregations across the U.S. and the world. He and I were also classmates at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He turned out pretty good. But when I spoke with him, it was not about those wonderful things. It was to speak about how influential Billy Graham's influence was in Rick Warren's life, even as his grandmother prayed for Rick's first attempts at preaching when he was still in his teens.
My grandmother was quite a godly woman. She prayed every day. And when I began preaching as a teenager, she said, I pray for Billy Graham and you every single day. And I've never forgotten that. But it would be hard to overestimate Billy Graham's influence on my life and ministry and on Saddleback Church, the Purpose-Driven Network, and all those other things. He's had 40 years of influence.
You know, when I think about the fact that there were millions of people that he touched, but one of them was you, and now you have touched millions and millions and millions of people through your writing and through Saddleback Church. It truly is the multiplication effect of his life and ministry. Does that just sink into you every now and then?
That influence happened because Billy was intentional about one thing. He was an encourager of the next generation. And I've tried to do this myself now in my ministry. But when I was a 20-year-old, really nobody knew who I was. He showed an interest in me. And the things that I'll cherish over my lifetime are the many letters and the cards and calls. In my office, there hangs on a wall one of the letters which Billy Graham wrote to me. I think it was after the first time I was interviewed on Larry King. And it stands between a letter from Martin Luther King and from Mother Teresa. And it was effusive in its praise. And of course, it was all hyperbole, but it meant so much to me. And it was an encouragement that encouraged me to go. I remember I wrote my first book when I was in college. It was called Bible Study Methods. And in the middle of the 80s, when Billy Graham decided to invite 13,000 evangelists from 190 countries to Amsterdam for 10 days for training, he calls me up. I'm in my 20s. And he says, Rick, I like this book. I want you to come teach how to study the Bible to 13,000 evangelists. I'm going to give a free copy to everybody. At that time, Mike, I wasn't very confident in my writing. And yet I thought, well, if Billy Graham thinks it's okay, maybe it's okay. And if I hadn't gotten that encouragement, I don't know if Purpose-Driven Life would have ever been written. You never know the power of a positive word. Everybody needs encouragement, and Billy Graham was gracious to everybody.
Rick, when people met Billy Graham the first time, I mean, he's a larger-than-life figure. Describe when you first met him, and were you just overwhelmed that you were in the presence of Billy Graham, this great evangelist that your grandmother said she prayed for along with you every day? How was that moment when you first met him, first time?
Great people make people feel great, and that's what Billy Graham did. I remember I convinced him to do his second to last crusade, which was in Los Angeles. And then I was with him on the last crusade in New York City. But I remember backstage before each night, he would ask Kay and me to pray over him right before he'd go out to preach. And the humility just had to make you love a guy like that, because he was impressed with God. We take ourselves too seriously. We don't take God seriously enough. Billy Graham did the opposite. He didn't take himself real seriously, but he took God very seriously, and it showed.
Rick, listening to Billy Graham, whether it was an interview or a sermon or just a conversation, the one thing that became very evident was that every time he was asked a question, he moved as quickly as he could to talk about Jesus Christ.
Billy never got off focus. He never got off track. And he was winsome with the gospel. He gossiped the gospel wherever he went, and God honored that. Jesus says, if I'm lifted up, I'll draw all men to me. Billy realized he's not primarily a pundit. He's not a pollster. You know, he's not a philosopher. He was an evangelist. And the evangelist is share the good news. And so he did it over and over in the simplest and the most clear way. And honestly, Mike, I think what the world is looking for today is an authoritative message in a humble personality. When you get those two together, an authoritative message, I know what I know what I know, and I know this is the truth. But it comes to a humble personality, that combination is almost irresistible. And it certainly was in Billy Graham.